The power that comes with the label. For some people, marriage or any label that implies association amplifies a partner's sense of entitlement, which then gets used as leverage for control, demand, and reshape the other person, just because they are my partner. If we really take that seriously, we start to see that what's really at stakes here is differentiation, autonomy, and freedom. First, I want us to really look inward, you and the people around you. When you are dating someone, or even in marriage with, do you see any of this behavior? Expecting the person to answer in certain amount of time, give care, attention, and love in the way you or the other wants. This is the reason people actually don't want to get married nowadays. We have seen it so many times. With that comes control, entitlement to you, your resources, and your freedom is gone out the window. Something has been twisted in the ways we relate to each other, because no one is even entitled to have a partner in the first place. If we really think about it, a person's presence is a gift, not something that guarantees anything, access, availability, or compliance. The more interesting issue is the huge number of implicit expectations that appear simply because someone is my partner, and those are often invisible until they are disappointed. So for these next minutes, we will explore what our ethical rights actually are in relationship, what kind of power we do have, and where do we have full immunity. If we stripped away the labels, a truly healthy relationship is an ongoing voluntary choice between two autonomous people. And quickly to mention, this is not only about romantic relationships. It also applies to any ties with friends, family, etc., relatives. And why this is important? Because this kind of entitlement over another person is linked to poorer mental health and poorer relationships outcomes. And so what I want to look at next is what a healthier way of relating actually looks like, and how to be in a relationship without misuse of control or power. In order for relatedness to be truly genuine and authentic, it should always be freely chosen. And although belonging is a fundamental human need, we also have the right to freedom. So, to belong freely means to experience connection as a chosen expression of one's autonomous self, rather than something imposed by structure, obligation, or fear. This does not mean we don't need connection. It means authentic connection requires autonomy as its precondition. A person who belongs to themselves, who remains self-directed and free to choose, is paradoxically often more capable of genuine connection because their presence, attention, and love are given, not owned. So then the next question. What about our duties and obligations on other people? Do we actually have that much freedom in relationships? We do have duties, but let's distinguish between perfect and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are strict moral obligations without exceptions, like the duty not to lie or steal. These are obvious and expected. Imperfect duties are moral obligations that do not prescribe exact actions or force specific people to act at specific times, such as benevolence or charity. Care and compassion in personal relationships fall under imperfect duties. Although society may recognize a general moral responsibility to help vulnerable people, but no one can strictly mandate that a specific person must provide affection or personal care on demand without violating that person's autonomy. And autonomy in relationships is not the opposite of connection. It is the condition that makes connection authentic rather than coerced. So when a relationship begins to function through fear, dependency, or pressure, that changes the relationship into inequality, and it's absolutely not an authentic connection then. That is coercion defined. When we obviously do wish we would receive love and care wholeheartedly, but actually we are not entitled to receiving that from anyone. There is a difference between the right to want something and the right to receive it. Let's look at the distinctions of rights. A claim right is a right that creates a binding obligation on another person. In relationships, claim rights should only exist where there is genuine mutual consent. For example, couples can agree on specific responsibilities or practical forms of care. But for example, no one can claim a right to another person's involuntary feelings, like love or empathy, if someone doesn't feel that. Who are we to change their inner state? These inner feelings belong to liberty rights. That is the freedom to hold a preference, desire, or belief without interference. So everyone's inner world is their own, and that is not to be prohibited or controlled. We cannot demand that they share any interest or feel identical emotional reactions with us, because they possess the right to experience their own internal reality. You as well have the right to want safety, compassion, or care. We as individuals are morally and psychologically entitled to hold desires without guilt or external prohibition. However, transforming that desire into an absolute entitlement to receive care from specific individuals alters it into a claim right, which asserts a binding obligation on others and changes it into coercion if it is not mutually agreed upon. Now, care ethics gives us another perspective here. Care ethics recognizes that human beings are relational and dependent, and that vulnerability creates moral responsibilities within close relationships. Care ethics asserts that while relationships carry moral obligations to respond to a need, these obligations are constrained by proximity, capability, and mutual consent. Now, what about the power we actually ethically and legally have in relationship? A power is defined as the capacity to alter legal or moral relationships, placing the other person in a state of liability to those changes. So practically, setting a boundary or ending a relationship is an exercise of power. When you state, for example, if our relationship lacks mutual support during major crises, I will choose to leave. You have the power to do that. But that's also where the power has been long abused. We instinctively know we hold this kind of power, but there is a difference between exercising a legitimate normative power, setting a boundary, and using coercive leverage, attempting to control another person with it. In moral philosophy, abusing a power to force someone to change violates their basic autonomy. And as we already got to know, autonomy is the fundamental part of authentic connection. And that autonomy falls under immunities. An immunity protects an individual from having their core status altered by someone else, meaning the other party lacks the power to force that change. For example, personal integrity, bodily autonomy, and core values represent immunities. A partner lacks the power to command compliance over your personal boundaries, body, or fundamental identity. These belong to you, and the other has no right in changing your boundaries, identity, body, etc. In an adult relationship, each person retains the right to decide how to use their own time and energy, and what kind of contact they wish to maintain. And if that doesn't align with the partner's wishes, they have the right to end the relationship. There is no right to change anything about the person, as our autonomy and preferences are our rights to have. However, you might think about the influence we actually do have on each other. Healthy relationships do involve mutual influence. People often do change for another person simply because they freely value the relationship and choose to follow through with the influence because it aligns with what they would have chosen themselves. Therefore, it remains their choice. For example, if my partner tells me they feel loved when I'm more verbally affectionate, I might happily do that. The key difference is that the change comes from my own value of the relationship rather than from being told that I owe it or that I'm being coerced to do it. Now, this coercion we experience often in relationships bridges us to this question of love mixed with dominance. Bell Hooks argues that love cannot truly exist where there is patriarchy, and that patriarchal systems corrupt love by introducing domination into its practice. She defines love as a verb, an active practice of care, commitment, trust, knowledge, and respect, rather than a feeling or a state. The critical implication is that love and domination are mutually exclusive. One cannot love someone while simultaneously treating them as something to be controlled, used power upon, a resource, property, or a means to one's own ends. Basically, the moment there is any kind of control that tries to erode one's own choice, it is a form of power misuse that is absolutely not respecting the person as their own free self. So where we might have learned to confuse power with love is the patriarchal nuclear family, where children first learn that absolute rule belongs to the father and secondary rule to the mother. This is the kind of hierarchical structure that teaches children that relationships involve power differentials rather than mutual recognition. When this happens, that a relationship becomes a hierarchical power game, we can analyze it further to Martin Buber's philosophy of relationship ethics. The assumption that relationship status creates ownership or guarantees access is an I-it mode of relating. It treats the partner as an object whose functions, attention, care, sexual availability, emotional labor, can be claimed. The healthy alternative, recognizing the other as a free subject whose continued presence is always a gift rather than an obligation, is the I-thou mode. As Buber emphasizes, the duality of the self and the other remains even though it develops into a unity that includes the duality, meaning genuine connection does not require the dissolution of separate selves. If we lose ourselves in a partnership, that is not love, but fusion, a form of dependency that destroys the very self that could authentically connect. Erich Fromm's humanistic framework positions freedom not as isolation but as the precondition for genuine relatedness, as genuine love requires the preservation of one's individuality. Did you notice so many relationships suffered during COVID with the forced proximity? A study was done about it. and people described it with feeling smothered and shoved in a corner, suggesting that the loss of autonomy in close relationships is experienced as a genuine threat, not merely a preference. While we would think we maintain autonomy by going outside and doing our things there, but interestingly, true autonomy is ultimately an internal state and can absolutely be maintained indoors through clear boundaries and self-differentiation if they are respected. But if the relationship simply lacks the freedom of two individual people having differentiation within the relationship, that forced proximity basically might have shown that. Supporting that, a cross-cultural study of Spanish and US couples found that a higher differentiation of self predicted lower anxious and avoidant attachment, greater relationship stability, and greater relationship quality, even when controlling for stressful life events. Differentiation of self is defined as the capacity to maintain emotional objectivity amidst high level of anxiety in a system while concurrently relating to key people in the system. High differentiation allows an individual to remain emotionally connected to a partner while maintaining a clear sense of individual identity and objectivity, even in a small room under high stress. That is opposite of fusion. In fusion, one person's emotional state dominates the others. Boundaries dissolve, and the relationship becomes a site of control rather than mutual recognition. It is shown that when people feel they cannot act in line with their own values and desires, they feel stifled, trapped, and resentful. That is why control, possessiveness, pressure to give up friendships or hobbies, dependency, jealousy, and blocked growth are such dangerous signs. They are often the exact things people mean when they say marriage or commitment takes over their life. A well-differentiated person does not compromise the self for the sake of marital bliss. And that is the whole point.